The morning of March 18th, 1945, a black Mercedes sedan wound through streets that no longer existed. Emperor Hirohito sat in the back seat, staring through the window at what had been the Shitamachi district of his capital city. 8 days earlier, this neighborhood had housed 750,000 souls in wooden homes pressed tightly together. Now it was ash, 16 square miles of ash, stretching to the horizon in every direction. No buildings stood higher than a burned-out wall. No trees remained, only charred stumps. The emperor had ruled this nation for 19 years, worshipped as a living god descended from the sun goddess Amaterasu. He had never before toured bomb damage in Tokyo. He had remained in his palace while American aircraft destroyed dozens of Japanese cities. But this morning, something had changed. His aides had finally convinced him that he needed to see what the B-29 Superfortresses had done. What he witnessed through that car window would mark the beginning of the end. Not because the damage was unprecedented, though it was. Not because the casualties were catastrophic, though they were. But because for the first time, the divine emperor understood that Japan could not win this war. The Americans possessed the industrial capacity to erase every Japanese city from existence, one by one, and there was absolutely nothing Japan could do to stop them. The officer who accompanied the emperor on that tour was a staff colonel from the War Ministry. His diary entry from that day has been preserved in the National Archives. He wrote that the emperor remained silent for most of the journey, staring at the devastation. Occasionally, His Majesty would ask a question. How many died here? When will reconstruction begin? Can the factories be rebuilt? The colonel had no answers that would provide comfort. At least 100,000 dead. Reconstruction would take years, perhaps decades. The factories were gone, and with them, the skilled workers who had operated them. Many of those workers were dead. The survivors had fled to the countryside. Japan's industrial capacity, such as it remained, was bleeding away with every bombing raid. The emperor's tour lasted 3 hours. It ended his relative lack of involvement in Japanese wartime decision-making. From that day forward, Hirohito would begin the long, painful process of accepting defeat. But the colonel who accompanied him understood the truth earlier. He had watched the bombing 8 nights before. He had stood in the War Ministry and seen the flames reflected in the windows, turning the night sky orange. He had read the preliminary casualty reports as they came in, each one worse than the last. He knew what this meant. The war was over. Japan had simply not admitted it yet. To understand how Japan reached this point, you must understand what the B-29 Superfortress represented. It was not merely an aircraft. It was the physical manifestation of American industrial supremacy transformed into military capability. The Boeing B-29 was the most advanced bomber in existence. With a wingspan of 141 feet, a length of 99 feet, and powered by 4 Wright R3000, 350 engines producing 2,200 horsepower each, it could carry up to 20,000 pounds of bombs over distances exceeding 3,000 miles. It cruised at altitudes above 30,000 feet, beyond the reach of most Japanese fighters. It was pressurized, allowing crews to operate in comfort at extreme altitudes. It was equipped with advanced radar for navigation and bombing. Most importantly, it could be produced in quantities that dwarfed anything Japan could manufacture. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. American factories produced nearly 4,000 B-29 seconds during the war. Each aircraft cost $639,000, an astronomical sum, but one the United States could afford. The industrial complex that created these bombers represented resources Japan simply did not possess. Boeing's plants in Wichita, Kansas, and Renton, Washington, worked around the clock. Bell Aircraft's plant in Marietta, Georgia, added additional production capacity. Martin's plant in Omaha, Nebraska, contributed more. This distributed production system meant that even if one factory was disrupted, the others continued operation. Japan had nothing comparable. Japanese aircraft production was centralized, vulnerable, and operating under constant resource shortages. By 1944, Japan was producing fewer than 28,000 aircraft of all types per year. The United States was producing over 96,000. In bombers specifically, the disparity was even more pronounced. Japan had no heavy bomber program comparable to the B-29. The closest equivalent, the Nakajima G-10N, never progressed beyond the design stage. Japan lacked the aluminum, the engines, the fuel, and most critically, the industrial infrastructure to build such aircraft in meaningful numbers. The B-29 seconds began arriving in the Mariana Islands in late 1944. The capture of Saipan, Tinian, and Guam in the summer of that year had provided the Americans with bases within striking range of the Japanese home islands. Construction crews built massive airfields on these islands, capable of launching hundreds of bombers simultaneously. The logistics required were staggering. Every gallon of aviation fuel, every bomb, every spare part, every meal for the crews had to be shipped thousands of miles across the Pacific. The Americans did this without apparent strain. Their merchant marine was vast. Their supply ships sailed in convoys protected by destroyers and aircraft carriers. Japanese submarines occasionally sank supply vessels, but the losses were negligible compared to the volume of material flowing to the Marianas. By March of 1945, 3 bomb wings operated from these bases: the 73rd Bomb Wing on Saipan, the 313th on Tinian, and the 314th on Guam. Together, they could put more than 300 B-29 seconds over Japan on any given night. The first B-29 raid on Tokyo occurred on November 24, 1944. 111 bombers targeted an aircraft engine factory on the outskirts of the city. The raid was conducted from high altitude using precision bombing tactics. It accomplished little. Cloud cover obscured the target. The recently discovered jet stream at high altitude scattered the bombs. Of the bombs that fell on Tokyo, few hit anything of military significance. The raid demonstrated that precision bombing from 30,000 feet was ineffective against Japanese targets. Subsequent high-altitude raids produced similar results. The B-29 seconds faced fierce winds that could exceed 250 miles per hour at altitude. These winds, unknown to meteorologists before the war, made accurate bombing impossible. Bombs dropped from 6 miles up were blown miles off target before reaching the ground. The Americans were expending enormous resources for minimal results. Something had to change. In January of 1945, Major General Curtis LeMay assumed command of the 21st Bomber Command. LeMay was 38 years old, a career airman who had learned his trade bombing Germany from English bases. He was known for ruthless efficiency and willingness to accept casualties to accomplish missions. His superior, General Henry Hap Arnold, had made it clear that results were expected. The B-29 program had cost billions of dollars. It had to justify that investment. LeMay studied the problem systematically. The high-altitude precision bombing that worked in Europe did not work over Japan. The weather was different. The targets were different. Japanese industry was not concentrated in massive factories like German industry. Instead, over 50% of Tokyo's industrial capacity was distributed among residential neighborhoods in small workshops. These shadow factories produced components for larger facilities. Destroying them required a different approach. LeMay consulted intelligence reports from the Office of Strategic Services. These reports contained detailed analyses of Japanese urban construction. Buildings in Tokyo were overwhelmingly wood and paper. They had been designed this way for centuries because of earthquake concerns. Concrete and stone structures could collapse in earthquakes, crushing occupants. Wooden buildings were more flexible, more likely to survive tremors, but wood burned. The OSS had even obtained pre-war Japanese insurance company risk assessments. These documents rated neighborhoods by their vulnerability to fire. Tokyo's working-class districts, where the shadow factories were, concentrated, ranked as extremely high risk. The city had experienced catastrophic fires before. The Great Kanto earthquake of 1923 had triggered fires that killed more than 100,000 people. Tokyo was, quite literally, designed to burn. American planners had tested this theory at the Dugway Proving Ground in Utah. There, in 1943, they had constructed replicas of German and Japanese residential buildings. The Japanese structures were built using authentic materials under supervision of Japanese-American architects who understood traditional construction techniques. The Americans then tested various incendiary weapons against these targets. The results were conclusive. Napalm-based incendiaries were devastatingly effective against Japanese-style construction. A single M69 incendiary cluster bomb could ignite multiple buildings. Dropped in sufficient quantities, these weapons could create firestorms that would overwhelm any firefighting capability. The tests at Dugway proved that Tokyo could be burned. The question was whether the Americans would adopt this tactic. The decision involved moral considerations that made some American leaders uncomfortable. Precision bombing against industrial targets was one thing. Deliberately burning residential areas where civilians lived was something else. The distinction between combatant and non-combatant became blurred when factories were located in homes. President Roosevelt had condemned the German bombing of European cities early in the war, calling it inhuman barbarism. The British had adopted area bombing of German cities in 1942, but the Americans had maintained a policy of daylight precision bombing in Europe. Would they abandon that policy over Japan? General Arnold wanted results. He made that clear to LeMay. How those results were achieved was LeMay's decision. Arnold would provide the bombs. LeMay would determine how to use them. It was a grant of discretion that gave LeMay enormous authority and corresponding responsibility for the consequences. LeMay made his decision in late February of 1945. Tokyo would be firebombed at night, from low altitude. The B-29 seconds would be stripped of most defensive armament to increase bomb load capacity. They would attack individually rather than in formation, spreading out over the target to saturate defenses. Pathfinder aircraft would mark the target with napalm bombs in an X pattern. Following bombers would aim for the fires. The attack would target the Shitamachi district specifically because intelligence identified it as containing the highest concentration of small industrial facilities and because it was the most vulnerable to fire. The operation was codenamed Meeting House. Briefing the crews on March 9th was difficult. The bomber pilots had become accustomed to high-altitude missions where Japanese fighters and anti-aircraft fire had difficulty reaching them. Now they were being ordered to come down to between 5,000 and 9,000 feet, well within range of enemy defenses. The removal of guns made the aircraft lighter and able to carry more bombs, but it also made them more vulnerable. Each B-29 would carry approximately 7 tons of incendiaries, instead of the usual 4 tons. But without the protection of formation, flying, or defensive armament, losses could be severe. Intelligence officers predicted that 70% of the bombers might be destroyed. The crews received this information grimly. Many wrote final letters home before climbing into their aircraft. They expected this might be a one-way mission. 334 B-29 seconds began taking off from Guam, Saipan, and Tinian at 5:30 in the afternoon of March 9th. It took 3 hours for all the aircraft to become airborne. They flew individually, not in formation, spreading out across the night sky as they headed northwest toward Japan. The flight would take 7 hours. In Tokyo that evening, the population went about their wartime routines with practiced resignation. Air raid sirens had become a nightly occurrence. Most raids involved small numbers of aircraft that dropped a few bombs and departed. The Japanese had learned to distinguish between serious attacks and nuisance raids. Early warning radars would detect approaching aircraft. If the formation was small, many citizens would remain in their homes rather than seeking shelter. The shelter system in Tokyo was inadequate anyway. The government had built only 18 concrete air raid shelters in the entire city. Each could hold 5,000 people, providing protection for 90,000 out of a population that had been 4.3 million before evacuation. Most people had dug small foxholes near their homes or designated safe areas within their houses. These provided no protection against the kind of attack that was approaching. At approximately midnight, the first B-29 seconds, arrived over Tokyo. These were the pathfinders, coming from opposite directions to mark the target. They dropped their napalm bombs in a large X pattern centered over the Shitamachi district. The bombs ignited immediately, creating fires visible for miles. Their job complete, the pathfinders retreated while the main force approached. The fires marked the target zone perfectly. There would be no need for radar bombing tonight. The pilots behind the pathfinders could see the flames from over 100 miles away, a crimson glow on the horizon that grew brighter as they approached. Inside the target zone, Japanese civilians who had initially ignored the air raid sirens now rushed from their homes. The pattern of fires made it clear this was something different. This was not a few bombers dropping a few bombs. This was the beginning of something unprecedented. The main force of B-29 seconds began arriving at 12:15 in the morning of March 10th. They came in at staggered altitudes, between 4,900 and 9,200 feet, far lower than previous raids. Japanese searchlights swept the sky, occasionally catching a bomber in their beams. Anti-aircraft guns fired, their shells creating puffs of black smoke against the night sky. A few B-29 seconds were hit. Some caught fire and spiraled toward the ground. But the Japanese defenses were quickly overwhelmed. There were too many bombers, coming too fast, from too many directions. The individual attack pattern meant that defensive fire was dispersed. The low altitude meant that fighter interception was difficult. Japanese night fighters existed, but they were few in number and poorly coordinated. They managed to shoot down a handful of bombers, but they could not prevent the attack. Each B-29 carried 40 cluster bombs. Each cluster bomb contained 38 M69 incendiary bomblets. When a cluster bomb reached an altitude of 2,000 feet, it burst open, scattering the bomblets across a wide area. Each M69 was a 6-pound cylinder filled with napalm. It was designed to punch through the thin roofing material of Japanese houses, then ignite 3 to 5 seconds later, spewing flaming napalm in a jet that would set everything nearby ablaze. The mathematics of destruction were straightforward. 279 B-29 seconds that reached Tokyo carried approximately 42,000 cluster bombs, containing approximately 1.6 million individual incendiary bomblets. Those bomblets landed across 12 square miles of densely populated residential area. The result was inevitable. The first cluster bombs to hit ignited scattered fires across the target zone. Within minutes, those scattered fires began to merge. The wind that night was gusting at 17 to 28 miles per hour, strong enough to spread flames from building to building. Wooden structures, paper walls, tatami mat floors, all provided excellent fuel. The fires grew exponentially. What had been individual house fires became block fires. Block fires merged into neighborhood conflagrations. Within the first hour, the entire target area was engulfed. The temperature at ground level reached 1,600 degrees Fahrenheit. Superheated air rose rapidly, creating updrafts so powerful they could be felt by B-29 seconds flying thousands of feet above. Some bombers were caught in these updrafts and flipped upside down. Crews reported seeing debris, including pieces of buildings and human bodies, carried thousands of feet into the air by the thermal currents. The phenomenon unfolding below was approaching, but not quite reaching, a true firestorm. A firestorm occurs when fires become so intense that they create their own weather system. The rising column of superheated air draws in surrounding air at ground level, creating hurricane-force winds that feed the fire with fresh oxygen. The winds can become strong enough to uproot trees and collapse buildings. The heat becomes intense enough to spontaneously ignite everything within the firestorm area. Dresden, Germany, had experienced a true firestorm. Hamburg had experienced one. Tokyo, on the night of March 10th, experienced something close but not identical because of the prevailing winds. Instead of still air that would have created a perfect firestorm, the wind that night was already strong. It spread the fires and fed them oxygen, but it also prevented the formation of a single, unified thermal column. The result was still catastrophic, just in a slightly different pattern. For Japanese civilians caught in the target zone, The distinction between a firestorm and a massive conflagration was meaningless. They faced an inferno that moved faster than they could run. The fires spread block by block, driven by wind and fed by the wooden construction that dominated Tokyo. People fled in all directions, seeking safety that did not exist. The fires had them surrounded. Some sought refuge in open spaces, parks or plazas where there was nothing to burn. They discovered that open areas provided no protection from radiant heat. People standing in the middle of parks died from heat exposure without being touched by flames. Their clothes ignited spontaneously. Their hair caught fire. Their skin began to burn. Some jumped into the Sumida River, joining thousands of others who had the same idea. The river became so crowded with bodies that it was possible to cross from one bank to the other by stepping on corpses. The bombers continued to arrive for 3 hours, from 12:15 until 2:37 in the morning. Each dropped its load and turned for home. The crews could smell the burning city through their oxygen masks. The stench of burning wood, burning fabric, and burning flesh rose with the smoke to altitudes where the bombers flew. Some crew members vomited. Others simply stared in horrified silence at what they were creating. B-29 crewman Richard Bailey, flying with the 9th Bombardment Group, later, recalled that he could almost read a paper in the cockpit due to the light from the fires below. The entire city seemed to be burning. When he dropped his bombs and banked away from the target, he looked back and saw flames reaching into the sky. He thought about the horror taking place beneath those flames. He knew that thousands, perhaps tens of thousands, were dying, but he was following orders, doing his job, helping to end the war. By the time the last B-29 departed, 16 square miles of Tokyo had been reduced to ash. 267,000 buildings had been destroyed. More than 1 million people were homeless. The death toll was catastrophic. Japanese authorities would eventually estimate 83,000 dead, but this number was almost certainly low. Bodies that burned completely left no remains to count. People who died in the river were carried out to sea. Entire families were incinerated together in their homes. Conservative estimates suggest 100,000 died that night. Some historians believe the true figure may have been higher. This made Operation Meeting House the deadliest single air attack in human history. It killed more people than the atomic bombing of Hiroshima 5 months later. It killed more people than the bombing of Dresden. It killed more people than any conventional bombing raid before or since. The survivors faced a nightmare landscape. Yoshiko Hashimoto was 24 years old, living with her husband, baby, and extended family in Tokyo's Sumida district. Her husband, an army officer, was on the outskirts of town guarding a military base the night of the attack. She would recall decades later that the B-29 seconds were dropping numerous firebombs, and it sounded like a squall. She was astounded by the intensity of the air raid. She had never seen one before. The incendiaries created a continuous roar as they fell. Each one that ignited added to the sound, until the entire city seemed to be screaming. She grabbed her baby and fled with her family. Her mother urged her to run for the river. They joined a river of humanity, all flowing in the same direction, all seeking water that might protect them from the flames. The crowd was so dense that people were crushed against each other. Some fell and were trampled. Children were separated from their parents and lost forever in the chaos. Hashimoto reached the river with her baby. The water was already crowded with people. She waded in, holding her child above the surface. Around her, people were dying. Some from burns they had sustained before reaching the water. Others from smoke inhalation, still others simply from exhaustion and terror. She watched her mother enter the water without the protective hood that might have saved her. Her mother's hair caught fire. She died in agony while Hashimoto watched, unable to help while holding her baby. That image would haunt her for the rest of her life. Her mother's face, looking into her eyes, burning. 50 years later, she could not speak of it without weeping. 8-year-old Haruyo Nihei had spent the day playing with friends before her mother called her in for a simple meal. It was just another ordinary day for children in wartime Tokyo. Then the sirens began. Her family took refuge in an underground shelter where the sounds of explosions and screaming rose to a crescendo. Her father realized that fire was approaching and that they would be cooked alive if they remained underground. They had to run. When Nihei emerged from the shelter, all she could see was fire. A strong wind was blowing, and burning debris filled the air. Clothing, tatami mats, and wooden fragments flew down the street like a flowing river of flame. She saw other families running, holding hands. She saw a baby on fire on a mother's back. She saw children on fire, still running. The images seared themselves into her mind with such intensity that 70 years later she could recall every detail. She described her memory as both vivid and curse. She could not forget. She would never forget. The firefighters of Tokyo were overwhelmed within minutes of the attack beginning. The entire city had 8,000 firefighters and 1,000 pieces of equipment. They possessed exactly 3 firefighting extension ladders for the entire metropolitan area of over 4 million people. This inadequacy was not accidental. The Japanese government had deliberately avoided building extensive air raid defenses because doing so would admit that Tokyo could be bombed. Maintaining public morale required maintaining the fiction that the capital was safe. Reality had now shattered that fiction. The firefighters did what they could, but it was hopeless. Their equipment was designed for house fires, not conflagrations that consumed entire neighborhoods. The water pressure in the mains dropped as demand exceeded supply. Hoses burst from the heat. Fire stations themselves caught fire, forcing crews to abandon their equipment. By 1 in the morning, organized firefighting had ceased. The city was simply burning, and there was nothing anyone could do to stop it. The Japanese military command learned of the attack through fragmentary reports that made little sense. The War Ministry received word of a major raid on Tokyo, but the initial reports seemed exaggerated. 100 American bombers dropping incendiaries could not possibly destroy 16 square miles of the city. The numbers must be wrong. The reports must be hysterical. As dawn broke and reconnaissance aircraft flew over Tokyo, the truth became undeniable. The photographs showed devastation on a scale that Japanese officers had never imagined. The aerial images revealed a flat, grey expanse where a vibrant city had stood hours before. Nothing remained but ash, and the occasional concrete structure standing like a tombstone. The target area had simply ceased to exist. Every wooden building had burned. Everyone who had lived there was dead or displaced. The industrial capacity of that district, with its thousands of small workshops producing components for the war effort, was gone. The psychological impact on Japanese military leadership was profound. These men had spent their careers studying warfare. They understood tactics, logistics, and industrial capacity. What they saw in those reconnaissance photographs was something beyond traditional military victory or defeat. The Americans had demonstrated the ability to erase Japanese cities from existence using conventional weapons. They had done so with apparent ease, suffering minimal losses. 14 B-29 seconds had been lost during the mission, most due to mechanical failure or accidents rather than Japanese defenses. Against this loss, the Americans had destroyed 16 square miles of Tokyo, killed 100,000 people, and rendered 1 million homeless. The exchange ratio was so lopsided it defied comprehension. Japanese defenses had been revealed as essentially powerless against this form of attack. Staff officers at the War Ministry began calculating the implications. Tokyo was not an isolated case. If the Americans could do this to one district of Tokyo, they could do it to other districts. They could do it in Osaka, Nagoya, Kobe. They could systematically erase every major Japanese city. The industrial base that Japan needed to continue the war would disappear. The civilian workforce would be killed or displaced. Food production and distribution networks would collapse. Japan could be reduced to a pre-industrial society within months. Most critically, there appeared to be no defense. Japanese fighter aircraft were being destroyed faster than they could be produced. Pilot training had been reduced to the minimum necessary to get aircraft into the air. Experienced pilots were dead, killed in the futile defense of the Philippines, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa. The replacements were teenagers with a few dozen hours of flight time. Anti-aircraft ammunition was in short supply. Gun crews had been reduced from exhaustion and casualties. Even if the defenses had been at full strength, the low-altitude night attack profile used during Operation Meeting House was nearly impossible to counter effectively. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Japanese intelligence officers reviewed American industrial capacity and made sobering assessments. The United States was producing B-29 seconds at a rate of over 100 per month. Losses from the Tokyo raid were negligible from the American perspective. They could replace 14 bombers within a week. They could expand the bombing campaign indefinitely. Japanese analysts obtained reports of American bomber production facilities. The Boeing plant in Wichita alone employed over 29,000 workers and operated on a continuous schedule. Bell's plant in Marietta was even larger. Martin's Omaha facility added to the production total. This distributed manufacturing system meant that no single point of failure existed. Even if Japan somehow managed to strike American production facilities, which was impossible given the current strategic situation, the other plants would continue operation. Japan, by contrast, had concentrated its aircraft production in facilities that were themselves vulnerable to bombing. Japanese production was already declining due to resource shortages and air attacks. It would continue to decline. The realization spread through the officer corps in the days following Operation Meeting House. Different officers reached similar conclusions through independent analysis. The war was unwinnable, not difficult to win, not requiring great sacrifice to win, simply unwinnable. American material superiority had reached a level that Japanese spirit and tactics could not overcome. This was a particularly bitter pill for officers who had been trained in the tradition of Bushido, which emphasized spiritual strength over material concerns. The entire foundation of Japanese military doctrine since the Meiji Restoration had been that superior morale and tactics could compensate for inferior resources. Russia in 1905 had been defeated despite material advantages. China throughout the 1930s had been conquered despite having far more manpower. These victories had reinforced the belief that the Japanese warrior spirit was decisive. Operation Meeting House demonstrated that this belief was wrong. Spirit meant nothing when the enemy could burn entire cities from the sky. But acknowledging defeat and accepting defeat were different things. The Japanese military leadership was divided. Some officers, particularly those with access to intelligence about American capabilities, understood that continuing the war would only increase Japanese suffering. They began quietly exploring possibilities for negotiated peace. Other officers, particularly those who commanded combat units, insisted that Japan could still exact such a heavy price for invasion that the Americans would negotiate favorable terms. They pointed to Iwo Jima, where Japanese defenders had fought with suicidal determination, inflicting over 26,000 American casualties. They pointed to Okinawa, where kamikaze attacks and fanatical ground resistance had killed over 12,000 Americans. If Japan could multiply these casualty figures during the defense of the home islands, surely America would lose its will to continue. This faction argued for Operation Ketsugo, the plan to turn every Japanese civilian into a weapon. 100 million people died together for the emperor. It was insane, but it had adherents at the highest levels of command. The March 10th raid was only the beginning. General LeMay and his commanders had proven that firebombing worked. The Tokyo strike had been a rousing success from the American military perspective. It had destroyed its target area almost completely. It had killed or displaced huge numbers of workers needed for war production. It had done so with acceptable losses. The Americans had no intention of stopping. Over the following week, LeMay ordered similar attacks on other Japanese cities. Nagoya was hit on March 11th and 12th. 310 B-29 seconds dropped 2,000 tons of incendiaries, destroying 7 square miles and killing approximately 3,000 people. Osaka was attacked on March 13th. 274 bombers incinerated 9 square miles of Japan's second-largest city. Kobe was struck on March 16th. 331 bombers burned 7 square miles and killed over 8,000. In less than 10 days, 4 of Japan's 6 largest cities had been devastated by firebombing. The pattern was clear and terrifying. The Americans were systematically destroying Japan's urban industrial base. They were doing it methodically, city by city, with raids involving hundreds of aircraft dropping thousands of tons of incendiaries. Japanese defenses were powerless to prevent it. The few Japanese fighters that managed to intercept the bombers were overwhelmed by numbers. Anti-aircraft fire was ineffective against aircraft flying at varying altitudes in darkness. The best Japanese response was to evacuate cities before they were bombed, but this created its own crisis. Millions of Japanese civilians fled to the countryside, disrupting agriculture and overwhelming the capacity of rural areas to support them. The urban workforce that Japan needed to produce weapons was dispersing. Skilled workers were abandoning their factories to protect their families. The Japanese economy was entering a death spiral. Emperor Hirohito's tour on March 18th must be understood in this context. It was not a response to one terrible raid. It was a response to the realization that American air power could and would destroy every Japanese city. The emperor, advised by moderate members of his court, had decided he needed to see the devastation firsthand. His advisers believed that only direct observation would convince him of the need to seek peace. They were correct. The emperor's 3-hour tour through the Shitamachi ruins marked a turning point. Hirohito had always been more involved in military affairs than he publicly acknowledged. He received detailed briefings from his generals. He understood the strategic situation, but seeing the destruction, smelling the still smouldering ruins, observing the dazed survivors wandering through the ash, affected him in ways that briefing papers had not. This was his capital. These were his subjects. And American bombers had done this in one night. If they could do it once, they could do it repeatedly, until nothing remained of Japan but ruins. The Japanese government attempted to use the Tokyo bombing for propaganda purposes. State-controlled media covered the attack extensively, describing it as an atrocity perpetrated by the Americans. The official term used was slaughter bombing. Radio Tokyo broadcast outraged commentary about American barbarism. Newspapers featured front-page photographs of the destruction. The propaganda campaign was intended to strengthen Japanese resolve, to convince the population that they were fighting against an evil enemy who murdered civilians indiscriminately. The propaganda had the opposite effect. Japanese civilians were not stupid. They could see that their government had been lying to them about the war. They had been told that Japan was winning. They had been told that American forces were being crushed. They had been told that divine protection would save Japan. The bombing proved all of this false. If the Americans could burn Tokyo, they would not lose. If 100,000 Japanese could die in a single night, divine protection was not working. The propaganda, intended to inspire resistance, instead convinced many Japanese that the war was lost. The bombing campaign continued relentlessly. After the initial March raids exhausted the stockpile of incendiaries, LeMay was forced to wait until mid-April for resupply. When the bombs arrived, the campaign resumed with increased intensity. On April 13th, 327 B-29 seconds dropped 2,120 tons of incendiaries on Tokyo, burning out another 11 square miles and destroying 170,000 buildings. May brought renewed attacks. On May 14th, 472 B-29 seconds struck Nagoya. On May 16th, 502 bombers returned to Nagoya. On May 23rd, 520 B-29 seconds attacked Tokyo again. On May 25th, 464 bombers hit Tokyo for what would be the final time. By this point, approximately 40% of Tokyo's urban area had been destroyed. 60% of the city was gone. The capital of the Japanese Empire had been reduced to rubble by conventional bombing. The statistics tell only part of the story. Between November of 1944 and August of 1945, the 21st Bomber Command flew 79 major missions against 64 Japanese cities. These missions involved 13,365 aircraft sorties. They dropped 96,480 tons of incendiary bombs, representing 61% of all bombs dropped on Japan by B-29 seconds. The campaign destroyed approximately 175 square miles of urban area in the centers of Japan's most important cities. Nearly 100% of the buildings in these areas were destroyed. Casualty estimates vary, but conservative figures suggest that over 300,000 Japanese civilians were killed and another 400,000 injured. More than 8 million people lost their homes. Approximately one-third of the people displaced by bombing had been engaged in war production. Their dispersal meant that Japanese industrial output collapsed even in facilities that were not directly hit. The psychological impact of the campaign exceeded its physical destruction. Japanese civilians who had endured months of hardship were pushed beyond their capacity to cope. A survey conducted after the war by American occupation authorities asked Japanese civilians when they had lost faith in victory. The overwhelming majority cited the firebombing campaign as the point when they realized Japan could not win. Not the loss of Okinawa, not the Soviet declaration of war, not even the atomic bombs, though those hastened the end. It was the relentless, systematic destruction of Japanese cities by conventional firebombing that broke civilian morale. People could accept military defeat on distant battlefields. They could not accept their own cities being erased while they watched, helplessly. Japanese officers who witnessed the bombing campaign described feeling a profound sense of helplessness. These were men trained to fight, to lead troops, to accomplish missions through determination and skill. They found themselves spectators to Japan's destruction. They could not fight B-29 seconds flying at night at varying altitudes. They could not protect civilians from incendiaries that created firestorms. They could not rebuild factories faster than the Americans could destroy them. Their military expertise was useless. The war had become an industrial contest, and America's industrial capacity was so vastly superior that Japanese efforts to compete were futile. One officer compared it to fighting the ocean. You could strike the water with all your strength, but the ocean remained unchanged while you exhausted yourself. The morale crisis extended to combat units. Soldiers stationed in Manchuria and China heard about the destruction of their home cities. They learned that their families were dead or displaced. Their motivation to continue fighting evaporated. Officers reported increasing incidents of desertion, insubordination, and combat refusal. The military police could not contain the breakdown in discipline because the police themselves were affected. Everyone had lost someone in the bombing. Everyone had seen their city destroyed or knew it would be destroyed soon. The carefully cultivated image of Japanese military invincibility had been revealed as propaganda. Japanese forces had been driven from every captured territory. The home islands were under bombardment. The emperor's divine protection had failed. What remained worth fighting for? The B-29 campaign also included tactics beyond firebombing. Starting in late March, American bombers began dropping naval mines in Japanese harbors and coastal waters. Operation Starvation, as it was codenamed, aimed to cut Japan off from external supplies and disrupt internal shipping. The mines were highly effective. Japanese minesweeping capabilities were limited. Merchant shipping, already decimated by submarine warfare, was further constrained. Food shipments from Korea and Manchuria were disrupted. Coal from Hokkaido could not reach industrial centers on Honshu. The Japanese economy, already strained by years of war, began to collapse. Factories shut down from lack of raw materials. Cities experienced power blackouts. Food rationing became increasingly severe. By summer of 1945, urban Japanese were subsisting on approximately 1,500 calories per day, below the level needed to sustain health. Malnutrition-related diseases began appearing. The population was literally starving, while American bombers continued to destroy what remained of Japanese infrastructure. In June of 1945, the tempo of bombing increased further. The 21st Bomber Command released over 20,000 tons of incendiaries in 15 missions, involving more than 3,000 sorties. The primary targets were still Tokyo, Osaka, and Kobe, but as destruction of these cities became more complete, the command turned to secondary targets. Cities with populations between 50,000 and 100,000, previously considered too small to warrant attention, now found themselves on the target list. Hachioji, Toyama, Fukuoka, all experienced the same treatment that had devastated Tokyo. On June 15th, when 444 B-29 seconds attacked Osaka, not one Japanese fighter rose to intercept. The Japanese had effectively ceased attempting to defend their cities. They were preserving their remaining aircraft for Operation Ketsugo, the planned defense against American invasion. From the American perspective, this lack of opposition made the bombing campaign even more efficient. Bombers could fly their missions without harassment, dropping their loads with greater accuracy and suffering minimal losses. Japanese military leadership faced an impossible dilemma. They understood that continuing the war meant watching Japan burn, but surrender was inconceivable to many officers who had been indoctrinated since childhood with the code of Bushido. Surrender meant dishonor. It meant admitting that the emperor was not divine. It meant accepting that everything they had believed was wrong. Some officers resolved this dilemma through denial. They insisted that American industrial capacity would eventually be exhausted. They claimed that Germany's defeat in Europe would free American resources for the Pacific, but that this redeployment would take time, and during that time Japan could prepare impregnable defenses. They pointed to the plans for Operation Ketsugo, which called for every Japanese civilian to become a fighter. With 100 million people ready to die for the emperor, the Americans would surely negotiate rather than pay the price for invasion. This calculation was based on a fundamental misunderstanding of American psychology. Japanese officers projected their own values onto their enemy. They believed Americans, being materialistic and individualistic, would not tolerate heavy casualties. They believed American public opinion would turn against the war if American losses became severe enough. This assessment was not entirely wrong. American leaders were indeed concerned about casualties. Plans for Operation Downfall, the invasion of Japan, estimated American casualties could reach 500,000 or more. These projections troubled President Truman and his advisors, but Japanese officers failed to understand that Americans were equally capable of determination and sacrifice when they believed the cause was just. After Pearl Harbor, after Bataan, after the reports of Japanese atrocities against prisoners and civilians, Americans viewed the war against Japan as a fight against barbarism. American public opinion supported using whatever means necessary to end the war, including weapons that killed civilians. The firebombing campaign, despite killing hundreds of thousands of non-combatants, generated minimal controversy in the United States. Americans saw it as justified by Japanese aggression and necessary to save American lives. The atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima on August 6th and Nagasaki on August 9th are often credited with forcing Japan's surrender. This is partially true but incomplete. The atomic bombs provided Emperor Hirohito with a face-saving reason to intervene personally in the decision to end the war. He could claim that Japan was defeated not by conventional military means, but by a weapon that harnessed the fundamental forces of the universe. No nation could be expected to resist such a weapon. Japanese military honor was preserved. But the groundwork for surrender had been laid by the firebombing campaign. The systematic destruction of Japan's cities, the collapse of industrial production, the disintegration of civilian morale, all of these were products of conventional bombing with incendiaries. The atomic bombs accelerated a process that was already underway. When Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender on August 15th, he specifically mentioned the cruel bomb as a reason for accepting the Potsdam Declaration. He warned that continuing to fight would lead not only to the collapse of the Japanese nation, but to the extinction of human civilization itself. He was referring to atomic weapons, but his statement reflected a broader truth. Japan had already experienced extinction on a city-by-city basis through conventional bombing. Tokyo, Osaka, Nagoya, Kobe, Yokohama, all had been effectively destroyed. 64 Japanese cities had been burned. Over 170 square miles of urban area had been reduced to ash. If the war continued, the remaining Japanese cities would suffer the same fate. And now the Americans possessed atomic weapons that could accomplish in seconds what previously required thousands of bombers and tons of incendiaries. The Emperor understood that Japan faced annihilation if the war continued. Surrender was not a choice between victory and defeat, it was a choice between surrender and extinction. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.